Welcome to one of the most shocking cases ever written down in the history of Baton Rouge. Before we start, invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. Want to know which places and what times of day or night these true stories reach? On the morning of August 23, 1848, a local shop owner named Richard Caldwell was walking down the muddy path along the eastern side of the Mississippi River just outside the growing town of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The air was thick and sticky with humidity, which was normal during late summer in the area. What caught his eye, and what would later become the first written piece of proof in the Whitmore-Brossard case, was an abandoned carriage, with its wheel partly stuck in the soft riverbank mud. Inside the carriage, Caldwell found nothing but a single glove, a man's leather notebook with no writing in it, and strangely a silver locket with no photograph inside. The carriage had the symbol of the Whitmore plantation, one of the bigger farms, about 5 miles east of the city. By noon that same day, when Caldwell reported what he found to the Baton Rouge police officer, it was noted that no one from the Whitmore household had been into town for nearly 3 weeks. It was not unusual for plantation owners to stay on their property for long periods, especially during harvest seasons. However, Samuel Whitmore was known to be very careful about his weekly visits to the First Bank of Baton Rouge every Thursday, without fail. According to bank records looked at during the investigation that followed, Whitmore had missed 3 appointments in a row without sending word. The police officer, James Harrington, sent 2 deputies to the Whitmore plantation later that afternoon. What they discovered there would become the foundation of one of the most shocking written cases in the history of East Baton Rouge Parish. The case that, for reasons that will become clear, was deliberately kept out of official records for nearly 70 years. According to the deputy's first report, the main house appeared to be in perfect order. The 27 enslaved people who worked the cotton fields continued their work as if nothing was wrong. The house servants kept doing their duties. Had been prepared and served. Beds had been made. It was as if the Whitmore family was simply somewhere else on the property, but they weren't. Samuel Whitmore, age 46, his wife Elizabeth, age 42, and their 3 adult children, Thomas, age 23, Catherine, age 20, and William, age 18, were nowhere to be found. The only member of the household who seemed out of place was Adeline Brossard, an enslaved houseworker of about 30 years of age, who, according to the other servants, had started sitting motionless in the parlor when not doing her duties. When questioned by the deputies, none of the enslaved people reported anything unusual. Each one gave the exact same answer, said in almost the same words: "Master Whitmore has gone to visit his brother in Natchez. He is expected back before the harvest." Samuel Whitmore had no brother in Natchez. According to all available records, he had no brothers at all. The following weeks, an investigation was quietly done. The neighboring plantation owners were asked questions. The Whitmore family's absence was talked about, but strangely none expressed concern. The enslaved people on the property, they all seemed to accept without question that the family had simply gone away temporarily. When pressed, they became uncomfortable and changed the subject. Parish records from September 1848 show that a more formal investigation was quietly started by Judge Martin Lambert, who had been a business partner of Samuel Whitmore. It was Lambert who first noticed what he called the strange silence that seemed to hang over the entire Whitmore case. "It is not merely that the family has disappeared," he wrote in his private journal discovered decades later. "It is that no one seems to want to speak of it. It is as if the community has all agreed together to look away." By October of 1848, with the Whitmore family. Still missing, the plantation continued to work as if nothing was wrong. The harvest went forward on schedule. Cotton was collected, processed, and shipped to market. Profits were put into the Whitmore account at the First Bank of Baton Rouge. According to bank records, the deposits were approved by a signature matching Samuel Whitmore's, though the man himself was never seen. It was during this time that reports first began to come out about Adeline Brossard's behavior. The enslaved house worker, who had earlier been noted as sitting motionless in the parlor, was now observed by other servants to be living in the master bedroom. According to whispered accounts that were later written down by Lambert, she had started wearing Elizabeth Whitmore's clothes and jewelry. More disturbing were the reports that Adeline had begun to speak as if she were Mrs. Whitmore, giving orders in a perfect copy of the missing woman's voice and mannerisms. The other house servants, apparently scared, obeyed without question. In his private notes, Judge Lambert described interviewing an enslaved field worker named Moses, who had been caught trying to run away from the plantation in early November. Moses, before being returned to the Whitmore property, supposedly told Lambert, "There ain't no wits no more. Miss Adeline says there never was." The judge noted that after Moses was returned to the plantation, the man was never seen again. His disappearance was explained away as a successful escape, even though the patrols had been doubled. After his first attempt, by December of 1848, a strange pattern had appeared. The Whitmore plantation continued to work. Business deals happened. Cotton was sold. Supplies were bought. Yet the family remained absent. More troubling were the reports from the few workers and merchants who visited the property. They described being greeted by Adeline Brossard, who now openly presented herself as Mrs. Whitmore. According to one account by a hat maker who had come to deliver hats ordered months earlier by Elizabeth Whitmore, the Negro woman received me in the parlor dressed in Mrs. Whitmore's clothing. She spoke with perfect speech and addressed me as if we had met many times before. When I asked about Mrs. Whitmore, the woman looked at me strangely and said, "I am Mrs. Whitmore." What disturbed me most was not her claim, but rather how naturally she seemed to fill the role. Judge Lambert, increasingly troubled by the situation, tried to organize a more thorough investigation. In January 1849, his efforts were stopped at every turn. Local officials showed reluctance to interfere with what they called private plantation matters. Fellow judges advised him to let the matter rest. It was during this period that Lambert began to write down what he described as a conspiracy of silence surrounding the Whitmore case. In a letter to his brother in New Orleans, discovered after Lambert's death in 1852, he wrote, "Something has happened here that no one wishes to admit. It is as if speaking of it might make it real, so they choose instead to look away and pretend." The most disturbing development came in February 1849 when a photograph was taken at the Whitmore plantation during a gathering of neighboring plantation owners. The image, which showed up in a private collection in 1931, shows what appears to be a formal dinner party. Seated at the head of the table is not Samuel Whitmore, but Adeline Brossard, dressed in fine clothes. More unsettling is the fact that none of the white guests seated around her seemed to find anything unusual about the arrangement. According to an analysis of the image done by Dr. Harold Bennett of Tulane University in 1934, expressions on the faces of the dinner guests show no discomfort or awareness that anything is wrong. They are talking, smiling, raising glasses. The African-American woman in Elizabeth Whitmore's clothing is being treated as if she were indeed the lady of the house. By March 1849, Judge Lambert's questions had attracted unwanted attention. reported receiving anonymous threats. His house was vandalized. In April, was removed from his judge position on charges of mental instability. Shortly after he moved to New Orleans, taking with him his private records of the Whitmore investigation. The most complete account of what may have happened to the Whitmore family comes from an unexpected source. In 1865, following the end of the Civil War, a formerly enslaved man from the neighboring Bradford plantation named Isaiah Cooper gave testimony to a Union Army officer writing down conditions in the recently freed territories. Cooper's account, kept in military files until 1948, describes events that happened on the night of August 1, 1848, 3 weeks before Richard Caldwell discovered the abandoned Whitmore carriage. According to Cooper, claimed to have been present at the Whitmore plantation that night, it had been building for years. Master Whitmore, he had a particular cruelty about him. Not the kind that leaves marks on the body, but the kind that breaks something inside. And Miss Adeline, she suffered more than most. Cooper described Adeline Brossard as having been bought by Samuel Whitmore in 1842. She had previously been owned by a French family in New Orleans, was educated, and spoke both English and French fluently. Whitmore, according to Cooper's account, had bought her specifically to serve as his wife's personal maid, but had other intentions. What Master Whitmore did to Miss Adeline over those years, it changed her, Cooper stated, not all at once, but slowly, like water dripping on stone. There was a day when something in her eyes just wasn't there anymore. The night of August 1st began, according to Cooper, with a fancy dinner prepared by Adeline. The entire Whitmore family was present. By Cooper's account, nothing seemed unusual until after the meal, when the family began to show signs of distress. They were grabbing at their throats, their eyes bulging. Master Whitmore looked straight at Miss Adeline like he finally understood something. And Miss Adeline, she just sat there watching them all. Calm as still water, Cooper's testimony suggests that Adeline Browser poisoned the entire Whitmore family at dinner that evening. What happened next, however, goes from the disturbing to the nearly impossible to understand. Miss Adeline, she gathered all the house slaves in the kitchen. She told them, the Wits have gone to visit family in Natchez. They will be managing the household in their absence. And then this is what I still can't make sense. Everyone just nodded like this was perfectly normal. Like they hadn't just seen what I'd seen. Cooper described how Adeline carefully organized the disposal of the bodies, directing several trusted field workers to bury the Whitmore family in the swampland at the far eastern edge of the property, an area rarely visited because of its bad conditions. After that night, Cooper continued, it was like the Whitmores had never existed. Miss Adeline, she started wearing Mrs. Whitmore's clothes, sleeping in their bed. At first, just around the slaves, but then when visitors would come, she'd receive them just like she was the lady of the house. The most disturbing part of Cooper's testimony was his description of how the neighboring plantation owners and Baton Rouge society responded to this extraordinary situation. The white folks, they'd come to dinner, sit at her table, talk with her like she was one of them. It wasn't that they were fooled. They knew who she was. It was like they chose not to see what was happening. Like it was easier to pretend. Cooper's account suggests a shared delusion or perhaps a shared agreement that allowed the white society of Baton Rouge to interact with Adeline Brossard as if she were Elizabeth Whitmore rather than face the horrifying alternative that an enslaved woman had murdered her owners and taken their place. Judge Lambert, in his final known writing on the subject before his death, perhaps best explained the psychology at work. They cannot admit what has happened without admitting what came before it. And that, it seems, is the one thing they cannot bear to face. The historical record becomes increasingly broken apart after 1850. The Whitmore plantation continued to work, apparently under Adeline Brossard's management, though all official documents had Samuel Whitmore's signature. Business partners who had known Whitmore for years conducted deals through Adeline, referring to her in letters as the representative of the Whitmore interests. In 1853, a fire destroyed most of the main house at the Whitmore plantation. No deaths were reported. The property was rebuilt on a smaller scale. Operations continued. The start of the Civil War in 1861 disrupted cotton production throughout the South. Records from this period are scarce, but property tax documents show that the Whitmore plantation remained active, though at reduced capacity following the Union victory and the freeing of enslaved people. The Whitmore property, like many Southern plantations, faced an uncertain future. What makes this case unique is that there was no white owner to either abandon the property or try to change to a new labor model. According to local land records, in 1866, the Whitmore plantation was formally transferred to a Mrs. Adelaide White, described in documents as a free woman of color. The transaction was processed by the same bank that had handled the Whitmore accounts for decades. There is no further mention of Adeline Brossard in any official capacity after this point. Adelaide White appears in census records from 1870 as the owner of a modest but productive farm on what had once been Whitmore land. She is described as a widow with no children. The most unsettling postscript to this story comes from a series of interviews done in 1929 by folklorist Margaret Dunner, who was collecting oral histories throughout Louisiana. Dunner interviewed several elderly residents of East Baton Rouge parish, including a 94-year-old woman named Josephine Taylor who claimed to have been an enslaved house worker at a neighboring plantation during the Whitmore incident. Taylor's account largely matched Isaiah Cooper's testimony, but added one significant detail. According to Taylor, the conspiracy of silence surrounding the events at the Whitmore plantation extended far beyond simple fear or denial. It wasn't just that they pretended not to see, Taylor told Dunner. Some of them, the wives especially, they understood. They'd sit with her, take tea with her, discuss household matters, all the while knowing exactly who she was and what she'd done. And in their eyes, there was something like admiration. When asked to explain more, Taylor reportedly said, there were other wives who wished they could do what she did, not just to be free, but to make the ones who hurt them pay. Lived through her. That's why they protected her. That's why they saw her as Mrs. Whitmore. Because in another world, maybe they could have done what she did. The final written reference to the Whitmore case appears in a private letter written in 1936 by Edward Lambert, grandson of Judge Martin Lambert, to a colleague at Louisiana State University's History Department. In it, he declines a request to publish his grandfather's notes on the case. Some stories once told cannot be untold, he wrote. My grandfather spent the rest of his life haunted, not by what happened at the Whitmore plantation, but by what it revealed about the society in which he lived. Some truths are too terrible to admit, and so we build elaborate fictions to avoid them. The Whitmore case is not just a story about one family and one woman, but about an entire society's ability for self-deception. Adelaide White died in 1882. According to parish records, she was buried in a small cemetery on what had once been the eastern edge of the Whitmore plantation. Her grave marker, written about in a 1954 survey of historical sites in the parish, had only a name and two dates. In 1962, during construction of what would later become Interstate 10, workers digging in the swampland that had once been part of the Whitmore property discovered human remains. According to the brief police report, 5 skeletons were recovered. 2 adult males, 1 adult female, and 2 individuals whose gender could not be determined. The remains were estimated to have been buried for over 100 years. No further investigation was done. The remains were eventually reburied in an unmarked section of Highland Cemetery. The land that once made up the Whitmore plantation has since been divided up, developed, and made part of the expanding city of Baton Rouge. Nothing remains of the original buildings. No historical markers. Remember the events that took place there. If not for the scattered documents, private journals, and oral histories that survived, the story of Samuel Whitmore and Adeline Brossard might have disappeared entirely. One more silence in a history filled with them. What makes this case so disturbing is not just the acts themselves, but how an entire community could all agree together to accept an impossible fiction rather than face an unbearable truth. Reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying aspect of human nature is not what we do, but what we choose not to see. Today, if you drive along Interstate 10, just east of Baton Rouge, you pass directly over the ground where the Whitmore family was buried. Thousands travel this route daily, unaware of what lies beneath. Like the society that once chose not to see Adeline Brossard sitting in Elizabeth Whitmore's place, we move through landscapes haunted by histories we have all agreed together to forget. But some stories refuse to stay buried. They find their way back to the surface like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain. They whisper to us from old documents and faded photographs. They remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural but entirely human. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all. How many other Adeline Bruce have been erased from our history? How many other unbearable truths have we all agreed together not to see? The final entry in Judge Lambert's journal, dated January 18, 1852, just 3 months before his death, reads simply, "What frightens me most is not that such things can happen. It is that we can look directly at them and see nothing at all." In 1965, Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, a historian specializing in pre-Civil War Louisiana, tried to publish a complete study of the Whitmore case. Her research, drawing on many of the same sources mentioned here, was met with resistance from both academic institutions and local historical societies. Her manuscript was rejected by 14 publishers before being put away indefinitely, not out of shame for the institution of slavery, which has been well written about and admitted, but because the Whitmore case represents something far more threatening, a complete flip of the established order that was quietly accepted by the very society it turned upside down. Perhaps most revealing was the response Pritchard received from the East Baton Rouge Historical Society when she requested access to any records they might have about the Whitmore family or their plantation. In a letter to a colleague at Tane University, Pritchard wrote, "See, there remains in certain circles an active desire to suppress this history." The Society's director replied with a brief note stating, "No such family is recorded in our archives." This deliberate erasing extends beyond mere historical oversight. As recently as 1958, when the remains of what was likely the original Whitmore plantation house's foundation were uncovered during construction work, local newspapers reported the discovery as colonial-era ruins of unknown origin. One of the most convincing pieces of evidence supporting the truth of the Whitmore Brossard case came out in 1966. when renovations to the First Bank of Baton Rouge building uncovered a hidden compartment in what had once been the bank manager's office. Inside was a leather portfolio containing bank transaction records dating from 1848 to 1853. These documents, now held in the Louisiana State Archives, but accessible only by special permission, include ledger entries for the Whitmore account, signed in two clearly different handwriting styles, both claiming to be Samuel Whitmore. Handwriting experts who later examined these signatures confirmed that the earlier ones match known examples of Samuel Whitmore's handwriting from before August 1848, while the later signatures appear to be skillful copies. More telling are the subtle changes in the account's management after August 1848. Before this date, withdrawals were mainly for business expenses with regular transfers to merchants in New Orleans and textile manufacturers in Massachusetts. This date, while the plantation's operations continued, new patterns appeared. Smaller regular withdrawals of cash and most notably the purchase of several medical textbooks and French language books from a New Orleans bookstore in 1850. The account shows payment to a tutor from New Orleans described in the ledger as providing educational services on the plantation twice weekly. This same year, there are records of payments to a dressmaker, a jeweler, and an importer of fine goods from France. Expenses more consistent with establishing a new identity than maintaining an existing household. The bank records also reveal that in 1851, the Whitmore account funded the purchase of freedom papers for 3 individuals described only as former property of neighboring estates. This remarkable transaction, a slave owner using plantation profits to free other planters, enslaved people, went apparently unremarked upon by bank officials. Perhaps most significant is a note from November 1852 about the establishment of a separate account in the name of Adelaide White, with an initial deposit transferred from the Whitmore holdings. This marks the beginning of the financial transition that would eventually lead to the formal transfer of property to Adelaide White in 1866. These financial records paint a picture not of a sudden violent break in the social order, but rather of a careful, patient rebuilding of identity, one that required the cooperation, or at least the willful blindness of numerous officials, merchants, and community members over a period of years. The question that has haunted researchers for decades is, how was this possible? How could an enslaved woman not only murder her owners but take on the social position of the plantation mistress, however imperfectly, without facing immediate discovery and punishment? Marcus Freeman, in his 1953 analysis of pre-Civil War power structures, suggested that the very stiffness of the slave society paradoxically created the conditions for its subversion. The system was so based on absolute racial categories that when confronted with a situation that defied those categories, many simply could not process what they were seeing. It was easier to participate in a shared fiction than to admit a reality that threatened the entire foundation of their society. This theory is supported by fragmentary accounts from the period. A letter from Eliza Bradford, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, to her sister in Virginia, dated October 1849, makes indirect reference to the unusual situation at the Wubby Butte, noting that we have all found it more convenient to accept what we are presented with than to ask too deeply into matters better left undisturbed. The shared silence extended beyond the white community. Isaiah Cooper's testimony suggests that the enslaved people on the Whitmore plantation, with few exceptions, also participated in maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed, that the Whitmore family was merely away and would return. Cooperation may have come from fear, But Cooper's account hints at something more complex. A shared understanding that to admit Adeline's actions would bring swift and terrible punishment, not just to her, but to all of them. We all knew. Cooper told the Union officer. Every slave on that plantation knew, but to speak it would be to destroy it, and some of us, we wanted to see how far it could go, how long the white folks would choose not to see what was right before them. The photograph from February 1849 remains perhaps the most disturbing artifact of the case. The image, subjected to modern analysis in 1969, confirms that the woman seated at the head of the table is indeed of African descent, though dressed in the finest European fashion of the period. Remarkable are the expressions on the faces of the white dinner guests. Not disgust or fear, but what appears to be genuine social engagement. Dr. Catherine Monroe, a psychologist who studied the case in the 1970s, suggested that the dinner guests may have been experiencing a phenomenon she called selective reality, a form of shared disconnection, where a group agrees without saying so out loud to see a situation in a way that keeps their understanding of how the world should work, rather than see a former enslaved person who had murdered her owners and taken their position, a reality too threatening to their entire worldview. They saw what their minds could accept, a somewhat unusual but still recognizable social scenario where they were dining with the representative of the Whitmore family. Monroe wrote, "The human mind is remarkably good at reframing reality when the alternative is too psychologically damaging to think about. This theory is given support by accounts from the period that describe interactions with Adeline Brossard, Adelaide White in curiously unclear terms. A business associate of the Whitmore plantation wrote in 1850 of meeting with the lady of the house, who speaks for Whitmore interests with remarkable clarity and understanding for one of her station. The deliberate unclearness of her station reveals both awareness and denial. What comes out from these fragments is the portrait of a community engaged in an elaborate performance, one where everyone knew their lines but never admitted the script. Plantation owners, merchants, bankers, and enslaved people all participated in maintaining a fiction that allowed them to navigate a situation that, admitted directly, would have required violent resolution. The story of what happened in the years after the Civil War offers its own disturbing insights. Adelaide White's transition from representing the Whitmore interests to legally owning the property herself happens at the same time as the broader social upheaval of Reconstruction. In this period of tremendous change and uncertainty, the fiction that had been maintained for nearly 2 decades could finally be partially resolved, not through admission of the truth, but through its transformation into a new, more acceptable story. Adelaide White appears in the 1870 census as a widow and property owner of mixed race. Her neighbors, according to tax records, included former plantation owners now farming smaller pieces of their once vast holdings. The fiction evolved. No longer the white plantation mistress, she became instead a free woman of color who had somehow gained property. Unusual, but not impossible in the Reconstruction era. Church records from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Baton Rouge list Adelaide White as a member and contributor from 1867 until her death. The same church records make no mention of Adeline Brossard nor of the Whitmore family. Despite their prominence in the community for decades before their disappearance, the most touching artifact from Adelaide White's later years is a photograph taken around 1875, discovered in 1948 in the possession of a family descended from formerly enslaved people on the neighboring Bradford plantation. It shows an elderly woman of African descent dressed plainly, but with dignity seated in a chair on the porch of a modest farmhouse. According to notes accompanying the image, the woman was known locally as Madam White and was respected for her knowledge of herbal medicine and her willingness to treat both black and white residents of the area. The notes make no mention of her past, stating only that she came into her property after the war and was known to help formerly enslaved people established themselves with small loans and gifts of seed and livestock. If this image indeed shows Adeline Blizzard in her final form as Adelaide White, it suggests that she managed not only to survive, but to establish a new identity that allowed her to live openly, if not entirely honestly, until her death. The transformation from enslaved woman to plantation mistress to respected landowner represents an extraordinary navigation of the dangerous racial and social hierarchies of 19th century Louisiana. Adelaide White died on September 12, 1882. According to parish records, the cause of death is listed as complications of age. Her will, a remarkably detailed document for someone who had once been property rather than a property owner, distributed her modest estate among several families in the area, many of whom were formerly enslaved. The will makes no reference to her life before emancipation. The small cemetery where Adelaide White was buried was moved in 1959 to make way for highway construction. Her remains, along with others from the cemetery, were moved to Highland Cemetery in Baton Rouge. According to cemetery records, her grave marker, a simple stone bearing the inscription Adelaide White, 1833 to 1882 at rest, was not among those successfully moved. Today, her final resting place is unmarked. In the decades since, the Whitmore-Brossard case has remained a footnote in Louisiana history, mentioned occasionally in academic texts, but rarely examined in the reasons for this continued obscurity are not difficult to figure. The case presents uncomfortable truths about power, race, and shared delusion that remain relevant today. Elenina Pritchard, whose attempt to publish a complete study of the case in the 1960s was unsuccessful, wrote in her personal journal, "The Whitmore case is not merely a historical curiosity, a mirror in which we might see our own capacity for self-deception, our own willingness to embrace comfortable fictions rather than face disturbing truths." This observation gains particular meaning when we consider how the physical evidence of the case has been systematically erased from the Whitmore plantation house burned and rebuilt was eventually torn. The land was divided up and developed. The graves were paved over. The documents were hidden away or destroyed. Even the final resting place of the woman at the center of the story was lost to time. Yet the story continues, passed down through fragments of documents, oral histories, and the occasional academic study. It survives because, despite all efforts to erase it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and social structures. In 1964, during an interview conducted as part of the Federal Writers Project, a 101-year-old woman named Clara Johnson, who had been born into slavery in East Baton Rouge Parish, was asked if she remembered anything about the Whitmore plantation or its owners. After a long silence, Johnson replied, "Some stories ain't meant to be told straight out. Some stories get told in the spaces between words, in the things people don't say." That Whitmore place. Folks knew what happened there. They just found it easier to look away. And sometimes looking away is its own kind of scene. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Whitmore bird cases, not the initial violence, the poisoning of a family by an enslaved woman pushed beyond endurance. It is the response to that violence. A community's decision to participate in a fiction rather than face a reality that threatened their understanding of the world. The shared self-deception, this agreement to see what could not exist rather than admit what did, reveals how fragile our social constructs can be and how desperately we will work to maintain them, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In 1968, a final piece of the puzzle came out when a collection of letters was discovered during renovations to an old home in the Garden District of New Orleans. The letters written between 1848 and 1851 were correspondence between Elizabeth Whitmore's sister Caroline Beaumont and her husband, who was serving as a diplomat in France during this period. In these letters, Caroline makes several references to her concerns about her sister's family. In September 1848, she writes, "I have received no word from Elizabeth since my letter of July. I have written twice more and sent messenger to the plantation, but have been informed that the family is traveling. I find this most unlike my sister, who has never been fond of leaving home." By November, her concern had grown. "I attempted to call at the plantation myself, but was received by Elizabeth's maid, Adeline, who insisted that the family remained away on business. There was something in her manner that disturbed me greatly, though I cannot say precisely what. She spoke as Elizabeth might, used expressions familiar to my sister. When I pressed her on when the family might return, she smiled in a way that chilled me and said, 'They are never coming back.' But we need not speak of that." Revealing is Caroline's letter from January 1849. "I have shared my concerns with Judge Lambert, who agrees that something is terribly wrong. Yet, when we attempt to raise the alarm, we are met with indifference or hostility. It is as if no one wishes to admit that anything is wrong." Even more disturbing, I called upon the Bradfords, who claimed to have dined with my sister just the week before. When I insisted that this could not be true, Mrs. Bradford became quite cold and suggested that perhaps I was unwell. Caroline's final letter about the matter, dated March 1849, reveals her growing isolation. "I find myself increasingly unwelcome in Baton Rouge society. My questions about Elizabeth and her family are met with silence or outright hostility. Even Judge Lambert now suggests that I should let the matter rest. I'm beginning to question my own mind. Is it possible that I am indeed unwell? That I have imagined a mystery where none exists? And yet, no, my sister. I know she would never leave without word to me. Something terrible has happened at that plantation. But it seems I am alone in my certainty." Shortly after this letter, Caroline Beaumont returned to France to join her husband. There is no record of her ever returning to Louisiana. The Whitmore case, it seems, claimed not only the lives of the family, but also the peace of mind of those who could not accept the shared fiction. 24. Additional letters discovered in the same collection. Caroline never again mentions her sister or the Whitmore family. It is as if, unable to resolve the contradiction between what she knew and what society insisted was true, she chose to cut the matter entirely from her correspondence, if not from her thoughts. This willful forgetting, deliberate looking away, extends beyond the individuals directly involved to include the broader historical record. The systematic erasing of the Whitmore-Brossard case from official histories represents another kind of violence, the violence of omission that allows comfortable stories to win over uncomfortable truths. Yet, despite these efforts at erasing, the story has survived in fragments of documents, in oral histories, in the occasional academic study brave enough to face its implications. It survives because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the societies we build. The story of Samuel Whitmore and Adeline Brossard is not merely a tale of murder and deception. It is a case study in shared delusion in the human ability to see what we need to see rather than what is before us. It reminds us that reality is not merely what exists but what we are willing to admit. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that this ability for shared self-deception is not limited to the past. We too participate in fictions that allow us to maintain our understanding of how the world works. We too look away from truths that threaten our sense of order. And like the society that chose not to see Adeline Brossard sitting in Elizabeth Whitmore's place, we may not recognize our own delusions until long after they have shaped our reality. The final word on the Whitmore-Brossard case might belong to Judge Martin Lambert, who wrote in his journal shortly before his death. The most terrifying aspect of this affair is not what it reveals about Adeline Brossard, or even about the institution of slavery. It is what it reveals about us all, our willingness to embrace a lie rather than face a truth that disturbs our sense of order. I fear this tendency lies dormant in every human heart, waiting for the moment when reality becomes too painful to bear. Today, the city of Baton Rouge has grown around and over the land where these events took place. Modern highways, shopping centers, and neighborhoods have erased all physical evidence of the Whitmore plantation. Thousands pass daily over ground that once saw an extraordinary turning upside down of the pre-Civil War social order. The society that chose to participate in Adeline Brossard's fiction, we move through landscapes haunted by histories we have all agreed together to forget. But some stories refuse to stay buried. They find their way back to the surface. Like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain, they whisper to us from old documents and faded photographs. Remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural, but entirely human, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those we can see, but those we refuse to admit exist.